Between 1939 and 1945, across Britain, Europe, and the Atlantic Ocean, a war unfolded that modern memory frames in a single way. On September 3, 1939, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. On December 7, 1941, the United States entered after Pearl Harbor. Those dates are taught. What happened between them is usually compressed, and that compression changes who history applauds. Britain fought from the first hour. America arrived later, with overwhelming industry and cameras rolling. The victory banner, decades later, leaned west. Yet the bill, measured in cities burned, rationed lives, and emptied coffins, was paid early and paid heavily by Britain. This story begins before triumph speeches. It begins in the dark, in London streets during blackouts, in the North Atlantic, where convoys vanished without witnesses, in the air, where young crews flew knowing the odds were against them. It begins when Britain stood exposed, with allies falling and oceans wide. From 1939 to 1941, the United Kingdom, the British Empire, and Commonwealth forces fought Germany and Italy largely alone. France had fallen. Poland was occupied. The Soviet Union was tied to its own pact until June 1941. Across the Channel, German forces watched and waited. During those 21 months, Britain bled steadily, not in one decisive clash, but in attrition that never made a final headline. Merchant sailors drowned quietly. Cities absorbed nightly destruction. Factories worked under bombardment. Civilian endurance became a weapon. The United States, meanwhile, watched, traded, debated. American industry supplied Britain before American soldiers crossed oceans. Lend-Lease ships sailed while Washington argued the cost. The Atlantic became a shared space of risk, but not a shared declaration of war. When America finally entered, the scale changed. The war expanded into something enormous. Resources multiplied. Narratives formed quickly. Hollywood would later follow those narratives. Clean, heroic, decisive. But history is not only about the moment of arrival. It is also about the cost of waiting. About who held the line when defeat was plausible. About who lost the illusion of safety first. This documentary examines a difficult truth. Victory in World War II was collective. Credit was selective. Between the opening sirens in 1939 and the American landings years later, Britain paid a price that is easy to forget. And memory, once shaped, rarely corrects itself. Strategic decisions made in London were measured in hours. Mistakes carried immediate consequences. There was no distant battlefield buffer. Every loss echoed at home. Airfields sat beside farms. Docks bordered neighborhoods. The front line overlapped daily life. Leadership meant choosing which city would burn less. It meant sending crews back into the night. It meant hoping delay would eventually bring help. That help was never guaranteed. Until it arrived, survival depended on endurance. This period shaped everything that followed, including how credit would later be assigned. Years later, simplified timelines would blur these months. The waiting would fade. The losses would compress. But the imbalance would remain, quietly influencing how nations remembered sacrifice and responsibility. That memory gap matters, because it defines pride, policy, and perception long after guns stop firing. History remembers arrivals better than endurance alone. By the spring of 1940, the situation narrowed dangerously. In April, Germany moved into Denmark and Norway. In May, it surged through the Low Countries. By May 26, 1940, British and French forces were trapped at Dunkirk. The evacuation that followed became legend. But legends often remove the fear. More than 300,000 men escaped. Most left behind their weapons. Many believed the war was effectively lost. Those soldiers returned to an island that expected invasion next. Across the Channel, German divisions gathered. Across the air, the battle was about to begin. From July to October 1940, the Battle of Britain unfolded almost entirely in British skies. It was not a symbolic fight. It was survival. Germany needed air superiority to invade. Britain needed to deny it at all costs. There was no fallback position, no secondary homeland. If the RAF failed, everything else collapsed. Fighter command operated at the limit of exhaustion. Pilots flew multiple sorties per day. Losses were immediate and personal. There was no anonymity in the air war. Every downed aircraft had a face. Radar stations became as valuable as squadrons. Airfields were bombed repeatedly. Runways were repaired between raids. Civilians watched battles from their gardens. When the Luftwaffe shifted its bombing towards cities, Britain did not interpret it as mercy. It was understood as a warning. The Blitz began in September 1940. Night after night, London, Coventry, Liverpool, Plymouth, and others burned. Industrial zones and residential streets disappeared together. Shelters filled. Hospitals overflowed. The government calculated morale as carefully as ammunition. During this period, Britain was not simply defending territory. It was preserving time. Time for production. Time for diplomacy. Time for the possibility that help might come. Every month meant the difference between collapse and continuation. Across the Atlantic, the United States observed closely. Public opinion remained divided. Isolation still had supporters. Support for Britain increased through supply, not soldiers. American factories expanded. Ships crossed dangerous waters under neutral flags. The Atlantic quietly became a battlefield before it was officially named one. The cost of Britain's position was cumulative. Financial reserves drained rapidly. Gold reserves crossed the ocean. Empire resources were stretched. India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and others contributed manpower and material. Often under political tension at home, Britain held command responsibility while bleeding economically. What is rarely emphasized is how close the margin remained. Victory was not inevitable. German invasion plans were shelved, not abandoned, because conditions never aligned fully in Berlin's favor. Britain survived by fractions. Weather, intelligence, pilot rotation, industrial improvisation. The war years later would appear decisive and overwhelming. In 1940, nothing felt secure. Every strategy assumed losses. Every speech masked uncertainty. The empire endured because retreat had nowhere to go. This was not the era of grand offensives. It was endurance without guarantees. A prolonged exposure to danger, while the world decided whether Britain's survival mattered enough to defend. By 1941, Britain was still standing, but the cost was becoming structural. This was no longer just a military struggle. It was economic, imperial, psychological. Every decision now carried long-term consequences. British cities were damaged but functioning. British forces were stretched across multiple fronts. North Africa demanded men and equipment. The Mediterranean pulled resources relentlessly. The Middle East mattered for oil and routes. The Far East looked increasingly unstable. Britain was fighting globally while defending locally. At sea, the Battle of the Atlantic intensified. German U-boats targeted lifelines deliberately. Food, fuel, ammunition. Without imports, Britain could not fight. Without convoys, factories went silent. Merchant sailors faced one of the deadliest roles of the war. Often unarmed, often invisible, losses mounted quietly, far from headlines. Each ship sunk meant more than cargo lost. It meant ration cuts at home. It meant delayed aircraft production. It meant lives reduced to ledger entries. The ocean absorbed evidence efficiently. There were no victory parades for endurance at sea. Meanwhile, Britain's financial position collapsed steadily. By late 1940, gold reserves were nearly exhausted. By 1941, Britain could no longer pay for supplies outright. The empire began mortgaging its future to survive the present. Foreign assets were sold. Investments liquidated. Economic independence eroded under necessity. Lend-Lease arrived as relief. But it was not charity. It shifted balance and ownership. Britain received material, but strategic leverage moved westward. The price was influence. The cost was post-war autonomy. In December 1941, the war changed shape. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Within days, Germany declared war on the United States. America entered fully, not as an observer or supplier, but as a combatant with unmatched industrial weight. From that moment forward, the narrative recalibrated. The war became global in perception, not just in reality. American soldiers crossed oceans in numbers Britain could no longer match. American factories outproduced every Axis power combined. Momentum shifted decisively. But Britain's position also shifted. It was no longer the central pillar of resistance. It became a partner, increasingly a junior one. Decisions once made in London were now negotiated, sometimes overridden. Command structures evolved accordingly. None of this diminishes American sacrifice. It reframes timing. Britain absorbed the highest risk. During the period of greatest uncertainty, America entered at the moment when outcome, while still costly, was no longer solitary. Public memory tends to anchor on force and scale, on landings, on liberation imagery, on clear turning points. What it struggles to remember is prolonged exposure without relief. Between 1939 and 1941, Britain fought a war that could have ended civilization on its terms. It held not because victory was guaranteed, but because surrender had no acceptable shape. That phase did not end in celebration. It faded into coordination meetings and combined commands. Yet without that endurance, there would have been no stage left to share. As American power expanded, the public story of the war began to settle into shape. Narratives favor clarity. They prefer entry points, heroes, and decisive reversals. America's arrival provided all three. Britain's endurance did not. In 1942 and 1943, Allied strategy increasingly reflected American priorities. Major operations were planned around American logistics, American production schedules, American political expectations. This was not arrogance. It was arithmetic. Whoever supplied the majority eventually directed the flow. British commanders adjusted. Some resisted. Some adapted. Britain still led in experience. It had fought Germany for years already. Its officers understood German methods intimately. But influence now depended less on knowledge and more on capacity. The North African campaign illustrated this shift. British forces had been fighting there since 1940. They learned through hard defeats. They stabilized the front. When American troops arrived in late 1942, the campaign became an Allied showcase. Success followed. Credit followed louder. Similar patterns repeated. Italy, the Mediterranean, air strategy over Europe. British Bomber Command had carried the burden early, absorbing catastrophic losses in night raids. When American daylight bombing joined the effort, the combined air war became historically framed as an American-led technological triumph. Loss ratios told a quieter story. So did casualty lists. So did entire air crews erased in minutes. Experience was expensive. It just did not photograph as cleanly as arrival. By 1944, the war's center of gravity shifted permanently. Operation Overlord, launched on June 6, 1944, was planned collaboratively, but remembered selectively. Normandy became the war in popular memory. What came before became prologue. D-Day mattered profoundly. It accelerated the end. It forced German retreat. It saved countless lives that prolonged war would have cost. But it was not the beginning of resistance. It was the return to Europe, made possible by earlier survival. Britain's role by this stage was paradoxical. It was essential, but increasingly invisible. Its ports launched the invasion. Its airfields filled the skies. Its intelligence networks fed the landings. Yet the visual language of liberation featured different accents. Credit moved with momentum. Momentum moved with power. Power moved west. After the war, this imbalance hardened. America emerged economically intact, its cities untouched. Britain emerged victorious but diminished. Debt replaced reserves. Empire weakened rapidly. Global influence narrowed. Memory followed success. Cultural output amplified it. Films, textbooks, anniversaries. The early war years were compressed. The prolonged defense faded. This was not conspiracy. It was human preference. History remembers arrival better than waiting. It celebrates decisive action more than sustained risk. But overlooking endurance distorts responsibility. Britain did not win the war alone. Neither did America. But Britain paid heavily. Before the outcome was assured, it absorbed uncertainty first. It risked extinction without guarantees. That phase shaped everything that followed, even if it no longer dominates the frame. And when credit is unevenly distributed, so is understanding. That matters long after peace, because memory influences who is believed. When the next crisis approaches, when the war finally ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, the images broadcast to the world carried a specific balance. American troops celebrated in liberated cities. American flags filled frames of victory. The visual language of triumph settled quickly, and once settled, it rarely shifted. Britain celebrated too, but its celebration carried exhaustion rather than relief alone. 6 years of continuous war had hollowed the country. Entire generations had lived under rationing. Children knew evacuation before normal life. Industry had been repurposed entirely for survival. Peace arrived without restoration. Financial reality struck almost immediately. Britain emerged deeply in debt, largely owed to the United States. The wartime alliance transitioned into a post-war hierarchy. Negotiations replaced cooperation. Loans replaced gratitude. Strategic dependence replaced equality. The empire that had sustained Britain's global war effort could no longer be maintained. India moved toward independence. Colonial commitments weakened rapidly. Britain's global footprint contracted not by choice, but by depletion. America, meanwhile, entered a different era. Its mainland untouched, its factories intact and dominant, its military infrastructure globalized. The United States did not simply help win the war. It inherited the structure that followed it. With power came authorship. American institutions shaped post-war order. American media shaped popular memory. American perspective became default perspective. World War II, as remembered, began to resemble an American story with allies, rather than a collective struggle defined by uneven sacrifice. This shift mattered, because memory defines legitimacy. It influences whose warnings are believed, whose experience is trusted, whose decline is seen as failure rather than cost. Britain's early war years became footnotes. The nights alone, the months without certainty, the period when defeat was plausible, and survival required continuous risk. These details faded, not because they were insignificant, but because they were not decisive moments on film. History prefers clarity. It prefers heroes who arrive at turning points. It struggles with endurance stories that lack a climax. Britain's role before 1942 fits that discomfort. Acknowledging this does not diminish American contribution. It contextualizes it. Without Britain's refusal to collapse, there would have been no Western staging ground, no secure Atlantic crossing, no early intelligence network intact, no foothold from which liberation became possible. The uncomfortable truth is not about blame. It is about sequencing. Who absorbed the highest uncertainty? Who gambled national survival first? Who paid without assurance of outcome? Britain paid early. America paid later, with greater certainty of victory. Both paid in blood. Only one paid in near isolation. When credit overshadows cost, history becomes simpler than reality. And when memory simplifies sacrifice, future decisions are shaped by illusion. The Second World War did not belong to one nation, but its memory increasingly does. That imbalance leaves silence where complexity should be. And silence, in history, is never neutral. Long after the gunfire stopped, the consequences continued quietly. They appeared in budgets, in alliances, in who spoke first during crises. The war ended in 1945. Its weight did not. Britain entered the post-war world transformed. Victorious, but constrained. Respected, but dependent. Its leaders understood what had been traded for survival. Power had shifted permanently, and once shifted, it does not easily return. In the decades that followed, World War II became a reference point for legitimacy, for leadership, for moral authority. Those who appeared to have won it most clearly were heard most loudly afterward. Those whose contribution was prolonged rather than climactic were acknowledged politely, then moved aside. This imbalance shaped institutions, NATO leadership, global financial systems, security guarantees, the language of intervention. America spoke as the inheritor of victory. Britain spoke as a partner with experience, but limited leverage. None of this implies deception. It implies momentum. Momentum rewards visibility. It rewards scale. It rewards those who arrive with overwhelming force, rather than those who survive without it. Britain's war was largely a waiting war, waiting for reinforcements, waiting for relief, waiting for weather to hold, waiting for ships to arrive, waiting for allies to commit. That form of warfare resists simple storytelling. Endurance does not photograph well. Debt does not march in parades. Strategic patience does not end with a single date. So memory edits it out. But history is shaped as much by what is omitted as by what is highlighted. When the early years disappear, the lesson changes. It becomes about strength alone, not about holding long enough for strength to arrive. The uncomfortable realization is this. If Britain had collapsed between 1940 and 1941, there would have been no Western liberation narrative at all, no Normandy staging ground, no Atlantic bridge intact, no delayed entry to reframe as decisive rescue. Britain's survival did not guarantee American victory, but it made American victory possible. That distinction matters. Credit and cost are rarely aligned in memory. Nations prefer stories that reinforce present authority. Those stories harden into assumptions. Assumptions influence how future wars are entered and how risks are calculated. The Second World War teaches many lessons. One of them is often overlooked. Victory is not only about who finishes strongest, it is about who absorbs uncertainty first, without knowing if reinforcement will ever come. Britain did not emerge stronger from that gamble. It emerged exhausted, financially bound, and permanently altered. America emerged ascendant. Both outcomes came from the same war. Only one dominates its memory. This is not an argument over ownership of victory. It is a reminder about perspective, about how survival before inevitability is the most expensive phase of conflict. History remembers who arrived. It rarely remembers who waited in the dark long enough to make arrival meaningful. That silence remains.